Citizens, society, and the state. For many years, Mexican citizens have interacted with their government through an informal web of relationships defined by patron clientelism. Because the camarillas are so interwoven into the fabric of Mexican politics, most people have had at least some contact with the government during their lifetimes. However, interaction between citizens and the government through clientelism generally have meant that the government has had the upper hand through its ability to determine which interests to respond to and which to ignore. The role of citizens in the Mexican political system is changing as political parties have become competitive, and democracy seems to be taking root. Yet the old habits of favor swapping are ingrained in the political culture. Cleavages. Cleavages have had the most direct impact on the political system are social class, urban versus rural, mestizo versus Amerindian, and north versus south. These cleavages are often cross-cutting, with different divisions emerging as the issues change. But in recent years, they have often coincided, as urban middle-class mestizos from the north have found themselves at odds with rural, poor Amerindians from the south. Urban versus rural. Mexico's political structure was put into place in the early 20th century, a time when most of the population lived in rural areas. PRI and the patron-client system were intended to control large, illiterate peasants who provided political support in exchange for small favors from the politicos. Today, Mexico is more than 75% urban, and the literacy rate is about 90%. Urban voters are less inclined to support PRI, and they have often been receptive to political and economic reform. Social class. Mexico's Gini coefficient is 0.47, 2014 estimate, which means that economic inequality is high. In 2010, the richest 10% earned 37.5% of all income, reflecting the unequal distribution of income. This economic divide translates into higher infant mortality rates, lower levels of education, and shorter life expectancies among the poor. In very recent years, Mexico's middle class has been growing, even in poorer sections of the country. Some are from the informal economy, businesses not registered with the government, and others from new industries or service businesses. Middle and upper class people are more likely to support PAN, and are more likely to vote than the poor, especially as PRI-style patron-client ties unwind. Mestizo versus Amerindian. The main ethnic cleavage in Mexico is between Mestizo, a blend of European and Amerindian, and Amerindian. Only about 10% of Mexicans actually speak an indigenous language, but as many as 30% think of themselves as Amerindian. Amerindians are more likely to live in marginalized rural areas and to live in poverty. This cleavage tends to define social class, with most of Mexico's wealth in the hands of mestizos. North versus South. In many ways, northern Mexico is almost a different country than the area south of Mexico City. The north is very dry and mountainous, but its population is much more prosperous, partly because many are involved in trade with the United States. The north has a substantial middle class with relatively high levels of education. Not surprisingly, they are generally more supportive of a market-based economy. The south is largely subtropical, and its people are generally less influenced by urban areas in the United States. Large numbers are Amerindian, with less European ethnicity, and their average incomes are lower than those in the north. A typical adult in the South has only 6 years of schooling, as compared to 8.1 years on average in the North. Although their rural base may influence them to support PRI, some Southerners think of the central government as repressive. The southernmost state of Chiapas is the source of the Zapatista movement, which values the Amerindian heritage and seeks more rights for natives. One recent change worth noting is that the incomes of the poorest half of the population are growing faster than the average. Poverty levels are as defined by the government have fallen, and income distribution is becoming less unequal. For example, Mexico's Gini coefficient has dropped from more than 0.54 in 2002 to 0.47 in 2014. If significant numbers of the poor begin making enough money to move them into the middle class, cleavages that define political behavior will certainly be affected. Likewise, if job opportunities in the formal sector, businesses recognized by the government, spread into new regions of the country as the economy grows, regional and ethnic divisions may also change. Political participation. Political participation in Mexico has been characterized by revolution and protest, but until recently Mexican citizens were generally subjects under authoritarian rule by the political elite. Citizens sometimes benefited from the elaborate patronage system, but legitimate channels to policymakers were few. Today, citizens participate through increasingly legitimate regular elections. The patron-client system. Traditionally, Mexican citizens have participated in their government through the informal and personal mechanism of the patron-client system. Since the formation of the PRI in 1929, the political system has emphasized compromise among contending elites. Behind the scenes, conflict resolution and distribution of political rewards to those willing to play by the informal and formal rules of the game. The patron-client system keeps control in the hands of the government elite, since they have the upper hand in deciding who gets favors and who doesn't. Only in recent years have citizens and elites begun to participate through competitive elections, campaigns, and interest group lobbying. Patron clientelism has its roots in warlordism and loyalty to the early 19th century caudillos. Each leader had his supporters that he, in return for their loyalty, granted favors to. Each group formed a camarilla, a hierarchical network through which offices and other benefits were exchanged. Until the election of 2000, within PRI, most positions on the president's cabinet were filled either by supporters or by heads of other camarilla that the president wanted to appease. Peasants in a camarilla received jobs, financial assistance, family advice, and sometimes even food and shelter in exchange for votes for the PRI. Despite many trends toward a modern society, the patron-client system is still very important in determining the nature of political participation. Modernization tends to break up the patron-client system as networks blur in large population centers, and more formal forms of participation are instituted. However, vestiges of the old patron-client system were at work in the controversy surrounding the 2006 presidential election, with the losing candidate, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, accusing the winning candidate, PAN Party, of election fraud. Polls indicate that between a quarter and a third of voters believed Obrador, since decades of one-party rule had sustained fraudulence under the patron-client system. As a result, many Mexicans still deeply distrust government officials and institutions. Protests. When citizens' demands have gotten out of hand, the government has generally responded by not only accommodating their demands, but by including them in the political process through co-optation. For example, after the 1968 student protests in Mexico City ended in government troops killing an estimated 200 people in Tlatelolco Plaza, the next president recruited large numbers of student activists into his administration. He also dramatically increased spending on social services, putting many of the young people to work in expanded anti-poverty programs in the countryside and in urban slums. Social conditions in Mexico lie at the heart of the Chiapas rebellion that began in 1994. This poor southern Mexican state sponsored the Zapatista EZLN uprising. Representing Amerindians, it felt disaffected from the more prosperous mestizo population of cities in the center of the country. The Chiapas rebellion reminded Mexicans that some people live in appalling conditions with little hopes for the future. President Vicente Fox, 2000 to 2006, made some efforts to incorporate the Zapatistas into the political system, but the group still has not formally called off its rebellion. However, the federal government currently supplies electricity and water to the villages the Zapatistas still control, a measure that may have helped to quiet the movement. In recent years, the Zapatistas have put down their weapons and adopted a strategy that attempts to gain both Mexican and international support. Through an internet campaign, they have received support from a variety of NGOs and organizations, and their movement has gained international attention. In 2005, the Zapatistas presented the Sixth Declaration of the Lacandonyungue, which promoted rights of the indigenous people and called for an alternative national campaign to replace the presidential campaign. Since then, the EZLN has worked to organize an international organization for indigenous people around the world. Some protests have been staged by drug gangs. For example, on May Day 2015, the Jalisco New Generation, a relatively new organization, defied the federal government by burning buildings, creating roadblocks, and shooting down an army helicopter. 15 people died in the violence. The incident calls into question the success of the government's strategy of going after gang leaders with the assumption that the groups will be dismantled. New Generation formed from the remnants of defeated groups, suggesting that the gangs will not go away just because leaders are captured. Voter behavior. Before the political changes of the 1990s, PRI controlled elections in the local, state, and national levels. Voting rates are very high because the patron-client system required political support in exchange for political and economic favors. Election day was generally very festive, with the party rounding up voters and bringing them to the polls. Voting was accompanied by celebrations, with free food and entertainment for those who supported the party. Corruption abounded, and challengers to the system were easily defeated with tacos, or stuffed ballot boxes. Despite PRI's control of electoral politics, competing parties have existed since the 1930s, and once they began pulling support away from PRI, some distinct voting patterns emerged. Voter turnout is probably at its height in 1994, when about 78% of all eligible citizens actually voted. This is up from 49% in 1988, although any comparison before 1988 have to be considered in light of corruption, either through fraudulent voting or simply the announcement from PRI of inflated voter participation rates. Voter rates have declined since 1994, but a respectable 64% of those eligible actually voted in the election of 2000, 60% in 2006, and 63% in 2012. Some factors that appeared to influence voter behavior in recent elections are region. Regional differences are quite dramatic, with PRI usually dominant in the north and northeast and in the Yucatan. It usually competes with the PRD in southern Mexico and with PAN or PAN in the north. PRD has built its strongest support bases in and around Mexico City, which it has generally governed since mayors were first elected in the city in 1997. In the 2012 presidential elections, PRI candidate Enrique Peña Nieto performed well all over the country, winning 21 of 32 states, whereas PRD candidate López Obrador did well in and around Mexico City and also in the southern states. PAN candidate Josefina Vázquez Mota only won 3 states in northern and central Mexico. Poverty, marginalization. Traditionally, PRI benefited from strong electoral support in the rural, marginalized parts of the country, with votes secured through clientelism and assistance that obligated peasants to vote for PRI. During 12 years of PAN presidents, government poverty alleviation programs expanded and clientelism weakened, so that the results of the election of 2012 show that PAN, and to a lesser extent PRD, have expanded their popularity in rural parts of the country. Civil society. Despite the fact that PRI formed an umbrella party over elites in the years that it ruled, Mexico has always had a surprising number of groups that have refused to cooperate. These groups have formed the basis for a lively civil society in Mexico, which also provided an atmosphere where public protests have been acceptable. PRI practiced state corporatism, with the state mediating among different groups to ensure that no one group successfully challenged the government. PRI formally divided interest groups into 3 sectors: labor, peasants, and the middle class, popular, with each dominated by PRI-controlled groups. However, the Confederation of Employers of the Mexican Republic, a labor group, was an autonomous group that vocally and publicly criticized the government. PRI's downfall started in civil society with discontented businessmen who were not incorporated into the government system. This group was behind the formation of PAN in 1939, and though the party did not successfully challenge PRI for many years, PAN's 2000 presidential candidate, Vicente Fox, emerged to successfully challenge PRI partly because he had the backing of powerful business interests. With a narrow PAN victory in 2006, business interests again benefited, so PRI's old state corporatism clearly has been broken up, and even though PRI candidate Enrique Peña Nieto won the presidency in 2012, PRI did not capture either legislative house. In recent years, the number of non-governmental organizations, NGOs, has increased significantly. Many have pressured the government to crack down on gang-related violence, and some are supported by powerful business interests and are well-funded. Others focus on campaigns for clean government. After the murder of 43 students in late 2014 by a drug gang, NGOs pushed the president to go further than he wanted in constitutional reform to tackle corruption. What will emerge in place of PRI's domination is now the question. State corporatism, neo-corporatism, where interests not the government controls, or pluralism, independent interests have input but don't control.